All right, so in the previous lecture, I emphasized that conservatives hold a skeptical view towards human nature, believing humans to be flawed, emotionally, intellectually, and morally. And I showed how various conservative beliefs, such as in authority, in tradition, in property, all derive from this basic understanding of flawed human nature. This is quite distinct from the other ideologies we study, such as liberalism and socialism, all of which have a much more positive view of human nature, derived from the Enlightenment principle of rationalism. Okay. Furthermore, conservatives, much more than other ideologies, see human nature as something that is fixed and immutable. Put that phrase down: fixed and immutable. Immutable meaning it can't be changed. Liberals and socialists, on the other hand, tend to see people as what Locke termed a tabula rasa, which means a blank state. In other words, believe people are able to be molded to perfection given the right education, the right social circumstances, and so on. So whilst liberals and socialists see human behavior as perfectible with the right social institutions, like a constitutional government or whatever for liberals, for conservatives, human imperfection is something innate rather than a product of society. Yeah, it's natural. It's the natural condition of mankind. So in essence, conservatism highlights human fallibility. That word Aisha used before, fallibility meaning prone to failure, really, making mistakes. So in essence, conservatism highlights human fallibility rather than human potential. So in this lecture, I'm going to look in more detail at how 5 key conservative thinkers, Hobbes, Burke, Oakeshott, Rand, and Nozick, conceive human nature. So to begin with, Thomas Hobbes, writing during the tumultuous 17th century, sort of stormy 17th century, remember that was the time of the English Civil War. Thomas Hobbes, Hobbes. So Hobbes set the tone for all later conservatives, emphasizing the negative characteristics of humanity. He saw humans as needy, vulnerable, and easily led astray, self-interested creatures who above all craved security and stability far more than high-minded principles such as freedom or equality. He believed humanity's capacity for reason to be fragile, and that attempts to understand the world were easily distorted by self-interest or fleeting concerns. He was therefore far more pessimistic about humanity's potential for rationality than liberals or socialists. Although he is not generally regarded as a deeply religious man, his views have much in common with and are almost certainly deeply influenced by the Catholic concept of original sin that Aisha referred to, relevant to Burke as well. Basically, the idea that people are natural born sinners. Yeah. In probably his most famous quote, which Saba mentioned before, Hobbes believed that in the so-called state of nature, which remember is an imaginary society in which people lived without a state, that life would be nasty, brutish, and short. Or the full quote, Saba gave us the full quote: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Often people just remember that bit: nasty, brutish, and short. Self-interest, greed, and people's innate sinfulness in general would, in the absence of political authority, lead to a permanent war of all against all. Yeah, so this is just what human nature would be when left to its own devices, just fighting each other, brutal towards each other, killing each other, and so on. Hobbes' understanding of human nature led him to believe in the necessity for a powerful ruler to impose order on society, what he termed a leviathan. He believed that the benefits of submitting to such a ruler, namely the provision of security and order, and an escape from the dreadful state of nature, far outweighed any downsides, and that even the most tyrannical of rulers should be obeyed rather than risk the chaos, bloodshed, and disorder of revolution. Tyrannical.
What does that mean?
Tyrannical, unjust. If a tyrant, a tyrannical ruler, also known as a tyrant, is one who is brutal, harsh, and unjust. Will just kill people who don't deserve to be killed. Just this kind of thing. Unjust and brutal, really. That's tyranny. Okay, Edmund Burke. Whereas Hobbes was writing during the revolutionary ferment of the English Civil War, Edmund Burke's most famous work was a response to the French Revolution, which followed over 100 years later. Published in 1790, his reflections on the revolution in France similarly emphasized human imperfection, focusing particularly on the limits of human rationality. Strongly rejecting the Enlightenment rationalism, which had underpinned the French Revolution, Burke argued that society was so complex, it was effectively beyond human understanding, and so fragile that attempts to impose radical change on it, however well-intentioned, risked disastrous consequences. This was in stark contrast to the liberal view that human rationality provided the basis for the creation of perfect social and political institutions. For Burke, human problems did not stem from imperfect institutions, but from human nature itself. But this obviously left Burke with a problem. If humans lack the capacity to design rational social institutions, then what institutions should govern society? How do we know? What should we have to govern us? And for Burke, the answer was to be found, well, where do you think? What institutions should we have? Religion, which is one example of tradition, right? Exactly. The answer for Burke was tradition, really. Traditional institutions, including religious ones, Brian, you're right, were those which had stood the test of time, representing the accumulated wisdom of the ages. For Burke, then, what's known as empiricism, which is basically based on observation, observing what has worked in the past, was a much better guide to how we should live than rationalism, which relies on faulty human intellect to tell us what's going to work. Yeah, so it's better to rely on what's worked before rather than what we think is going to work, being as our thinking skills aren't very developed. Right? Burke then was fundamentally opposed to idealist political projects, which attempted to redesign society according to some ideological blueprint, and believed instead in what's called pragmatism. We've discussed this before, pragmatism, reforming society only gradually in response to changing circumstances. So that's Burke. Moving now to Michael Oakeshott, we can say that this critique of rationalism that Burke had was developed by Michael Oakeshott, particularly in his 1962 essay, Rationalism in Politics. Like Burke and Hobbes before him, Oakeshott was opposed to rationalism, believing the world was too complex and human reason too limited to ever fully grasp the complexity of human society. In particular, Oakeshott argued that the tendency towards rationalism in modern society, and especially in politics, had led to a disastrous devaluation of the practical knowledge that's embedded in human practices. He believed that practical knowledge, tradition, culture, all these things have been undermined by rationalism, right? By the idea that we can dream up, think up what's right, rather than just actually respecting what's been done before. Being unpredictable and complex, society can never be understood solely in terms of abstract theories or principles, which necessarily oversimplify complex phenomena. And such oversimplifications can lead, and have led, to disastrous and misguided attempts at social engineering. Do you know what I mean by social engineering? Trying to engineer society in the same way you would engineer a bridge, design it and then sort of build it up from scratch. Social engineering is doing that, trying to design society in the same way as you design a bridge. So think it up based on your principles and then try and just implement it. And he said this, he pointed to examples of communism and fascism, which he said were both examples of kind of rationalism gone berserk, really. People trying to attempt their blueprint for society that they dreamed up, believing themselves to be rational, trying to impose it on society with disastrous consequences. Furthermore, the rationalist tendency to design institutions according to abstract principles has led, he argued, to the undermining of culture and tradition, the very things which he argues provide the social glue that holds society together. Yeah. So, Brian, you mentioned you looked at this in sociology, this idea of kind of tradition and culture providing a sort of social glue to hold society together. And it's precisely culture and tradition that's undermined by this sort of obsessive focus on rationalism that Oakeshott believes exists in the modern world. Okay, we're going to move on in a second to Ayn Rand. But I just want to emphasize that so far we've looked at three thinkers who could all broadly be termed traditional conservatives. Yeah, Hobbes, Burke, and Oakeshott all fall broadly within this category of traditional conservatism. Now, for these next two thinkers, we're going to come to the thinkers associated with the so-called New Right, which emerged in the 1970s, although both of these two were kind of prior to that, they were influences on what became the New Right. And the New Right, it's important to note, although considered a branch of conservatism, is heavily influenced by classical liberalism, particularly in its approach to the economy, but also in its view of human nature. So, for example, Ayn Rand, we'll start with Ayn Rand. She was a Russian-born novelist and theorist who emigrated to the USA after the Bolshevik Revolution. Ayn, which is A-Y-N. Yeah, and then Rand, R-A-N-D. Now, Rand was, unlike Hobbes, Burke, and Oakeshott, she was a rationalist who believed in the power of human reason. Okay, so this is quite a fundamental departure from the ideas of traditional conservatism. Like the classical liberals, Rand believed that rational selfishness was the ultimate expression of human nature. Yeah, again, this idea of rational self-interest that the classical liberals had, Rand believed that as well. The idea of rational, so she believed that rational selfishness was the ultimate expression of human nature. This is rational self-interest. That's what people are all about. But she goes even further, arguably, than the classical liberals, arguing that altruism, what we mean by altruism, like the desire to help others, she argued that altruism was in fact a pernicious distortion of our true nature. So pernicious is like something that's subtly damaging. Yeah. So, you know, the idea of helping others, it's not obviously a damaging idea, is it? But she argues that subtly, it's subtly quite damaging. That's what we mean by pernicious. Yeah. I'll develop this point. So she said, this is a quote from Rand. She said, altruism is incompatible with freedom. You can't have them both, right? You have to choose one or the other. She chose freedom.
Is that a quote?
Yeah. Altruism is incompatible with freedom, she wrote, arguing that altruism was an irrational morality that was in conflict with human nature. And this conflict was tearing society apart. Right? So she's saying it's human nature to be selfish, and therefore altruism is against nature. And it's therefore kind of immoral, really, actually. So for Rand, the natural state of all humanity is essentially altruism, A-L-T-R-U-I-S-M. Altruism just means helping others, the desire to help others. So for Rand, the natural state of all humanity is essentially that of like a narcissist, right? Someone who believes completely in themselves, an egoist. Or even a psychopath, you could say, because she believes that the basic state of any human being is that the needs, feelings, or interests of other people have no significance or meaning whatsoever. Right? They shouldn't. It's natural that they don't, and they shouldn't pretend otherwise. This is basically what she believes about human nature. Yeah, the needs, feelings, or interests of other people have no significance or meaning whatsoever, which is interesting. As I was reading this, I realized, well, that's actually the textbook definition of a narcissist or even a psychopath. This is interesting. People are basically narcissists, egoists, yeah, fundamentally, and they're nothing else. So for Rand, one's own individual happiness is and should be the sole moral purpose of life. Yeah, and this is the basis of her philosophy, which she termed Objectivism. Say that again.
Your own happiness
should be the sole moral purpose of life. Like you might think it's moral to help other people, but it's not. The only moral thing to do is to do what's in line with your own nature, which is to be completely self-serving and ignore everyone else's interests. We might discuss afterwards discuss that idea a bit. But for now, that's basically her idea of human nature. Okay, and finally, final thinker, Robert Nozick, who's also influential on the New Right. He's a political philosopher. Like Rand, he too was deeply influenced by classical liberalism. He's best known for his radical economic views. Like Rand, again, he believed in completely unrestrained free market capitalism, in which the state did not attempt to redistribute wealth, provided no social safety net for the poor, nor funded any public services. They both had a very, very radical view that, the state should just not be involved in the economy at all, even providing the most basic things. Yeah, free market capitalist economy. But this economic philosophy, like that of classical liberalism, rested on, a rationalist view of human nature, which viewed humans as essentially rational, self-serving individuals. So the same kind of basic view as Rand had and as the classical liberals had. Like the classical liberals, he believed each individual to be the best judge of their own interests, capable of making rational decisions about their own lives. And again, this essentially liberal view of human nature put him, as it did Rand, at odds with traditional conservative views of human nature. So I'm trying to emphasize this big, profound difference, I think, between the new right and traditional conservatives, that they have this profoundly different view of human nature. Traditional conservatives think that it's, human rationality has been overstated and it's actually very limited. For the new right, they basically subscribe to the liberal view of human nature as rational, based on rational self-interest. So from this premise, Nozick put forward the concept of what he called self-ownership. Self-ownership is an important term in relation to Nozick. By this, he meant that he basically believed each individual owned themselves in the same way that the proprietor of a business owns his business, which is why self-ownership is sometimes referred to as a proprietorial model of human nature. So what this implies is that each individual has or should have absolute control over themselves, but also over all the products of their own labor. And if you think this through, the implication of this concept is that all attempts to redistribute wealth are fundamentally immoral and at odds with human nature. Yeah. So, and just before ending this lecture, it's just worth reiterating the profound differences between the traditional view of human nature and that of the new right. So traditional conservatives have a pessimistic view of human nature as essentially flawed, with a capacity for reason that is deeply limited at best. As such, they believe that individuals are not necessarily capable of making rational choices in their own self-interest. And therefore, they're deeply suspicious of any political project seeking radical change based on some supposedly rational blueprint for society. Yeah, that's traditional conservatism. In other words, traditional conservatism rejects Enlightenment rationalism. And indeed, this rejection can be seen as the very essence of traditional conservatism, right? For Burke, his whole philosophy was based on opposition to Enlightenment thinking. But for the new right, they actually share the classical liberal belief that human nature is essentially rational. And this belief leads the new right to support a radical ideological blueprint of their own, right? Namely, the imposition of unrestrained free market capitalism and the abolition of all social safety nets. But remember, it's precisely such attempts to impose one's own supposedly rational designs on society that traditional conservatism was basically founded to oppose. So do you see what I mean? So from this very different view of human nature, that humans are actually, they are rational and they are the best judge of their own interests and so on, the new right, based on that, the new right reached very different conclusions from traditional conservatives. In fact, opposite conclusions. They say, look, because humans are the rational, capable of acting their rational self-interest, that is the basis for their support for a very radical change in society towards a completely unrestricted free market capitalism. And remember, people like Burke and Oakeshott were, fundamentally opposed to radical changes because it interferes with organic society, can risk killing off the society. Society is too complex for our limited reason to understand, etc. So very, very different in those two ways, really, in the view of human nature and in, the idea following on from that of whether radical change based on a supposedly rational blueprint is, to be supported or not. So we'll leave it there.